So you take a look at IDC numbers. This was a record-breaking quarter for Apple in terms of shipments. But then you take a look at revenue for the iPhone, Nabila, coming in at $49 billion. That is just shy of estimates. And I wonder how one record didn't translate into another.
Well, that's a really good question. I think because obviously there's a lots of, different pieces. Definitely the iPhone makes a huge part of Apple's total revenue, right? Majority of 50% share. But if you just focus on iPhone, I think this is a phenomenal year, like you said. And like you see in our data, this is the record high, highest Q3, calendar Q3 ever for Apple. And this is, I think, exceptional because given everything that we've been dealing with, right? And you can see obviously the economic challenges, the headwinds, the geopolitical challenges, and this was a phenomenal launch. And of course 17, and there's a lot of chatter about the 17 and how well it's been doing, and of course a little bit of challenges with the Air, but we can't deny, right, coming out in this economic climate with all the uncertainty and inflation, for Apple to come out with a record-breaking quarter, and also ahead of the total market curve. So the total smartphone market grew at about just over 3%, but Apple came in at about 4% growth. But again, record high shipments. So I think that's pretty good news, and especially even in China, we're seeing positive growth. So it's looking good.
But even still, Nabila, I mean, let's talk about China a little bit more. And I should point out that Apple actually flipping into positive territory right now. But when it comes to Greater China revenue, it came in well below consensus. It was a massive miss, really. And overall revenue coming in about 12% below the consensus estimates. I mean, how much does Apple right now need China? Gil Loria's perspective is that it's becoming less important. All it contributes is volatility. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. I think nobody can deny, no matter how much Apple is trying, right, with strong growth, double-digit growth in emerging markets. Its growth in China has been challenged. Like I said, right, this was the first quarter after it was almost 2 years of negative growth. So it is finally coming into positive territory, but no one can deny that China remains the largest market for Apple, and competition is really heavy there, right, with a lot of loyalists and towards Huawei, and overall competition, and of course a lot of consumer favoritism towards AI. So I would say the AI piece is also hurting Apple in China, rather when you compare it to the rest of the world, where Apple is really growing much stronger.
Well, but how did they get that back, Nabila? I mean, you had the refresh of the phones, and I understand that typically is a catalyst. I understand that the upgrades that we had this time around weren't necessarily life-changing. But when you start to look at some of the phones, a lot of phones that aren't available here in the U.S., particularly some of the Huawei phones and others, and you look at the features there, I am just curious as to what that catch-up looks like. If people in China and some of the other non-U.S. nations become so entrenched in the non-Apple products, what is the catch-up ability that they have?
I think this is a broad statement to say that globally that we're seeing other consumers being entrenched into non-Apple products, right? Apple still maintains a really dominant share of the premium market. And they haven't lost hold of that. Of course, certainly competitors are coming up, but I think the biggest competition that Apple sees is certainly in China. But overall, globally, we see really strong growth in the segment that Apple plays, which is the premium, and they've maintained that ASP. We see, year over year ASP growth in iPhone, and I think this is what is going to help drive, and especially next year, if you look at the portfolio up ahead with, when the Fold comes out, this will really also help Apple break through, especially also in China, where foldables are doing quite well.
Well, let me add an addendum to that question, and this is more just about the growth overall in the smartphone market, not just for Apple products, but overall. And when we talk about the ability for additional growth, most of the discussion that I've heard has been about, obviously, some of the third world nations that are still on non-smartphones, if you will, and the idea that once you start to see people upgrading to more advanced designs, that will benefit potentially Apple and obviously the Android makers as well. Are you seeing that as well?
We're seeing overall, like the smartphone, definitely we don't see movement from across OSs as much, but certainly more from Android coming into iOS rather than from iOS going into Android. And this is, again, very interesting and it's not, I don't say counterintuitive, but it's counter to what the headlines are saying, right? That because, and I do agree that the Android phones and the Android players are phenomenal in terms of what they have brought, especially with the latest and greatest AI feature. But what Apple has done this quarter, at least, and what I think will help them continue to drive growth in the holiday quarter, especially, is gone back to the basics, right? With design and product differentiation and trying to hit different demographics. And simple thing as, design changes to the back of the Pro Max, as well as bringing the base model, more premium features than ever. That's really helped move the needle for Apple, and I think that's what has been the game changer here for Apple, right? And I think overall, as technology is moving really fast, but Apple still has some time, we believe, to catch up. So we will see how this holds into next year.
Right. It's really interesting to see the after-hour share movement right now up 1.7%. Remember, the initial read, the first blush move to these numbers was to send the stock lower. Different story right now. Nabila, you think about what's coming from Apple in terms of the pipeline when it comes to the iPhone. Of course, we have this lineup that Tim Cook and company have been talking up. Does a foldable phone excite you? Is that going to be part of Apple's growth story going forward?
You know what's really interesting and excites me is to see how much that Apple's entrance is going to change this market. So we've been seeing foldables from the Android players for about 6-7 years now, right? And finally this year we saw increased momentum with the Samsung Fold 7 really breaking through some of those barriers in terms of the changes it had. It was really well received, but Apple, but the still overall foldable market still is a niche segment, right? Well, when Apple comes in, this is what I'm excited to see, that, I don't think the foldable itself will be very different from what the Android players are offering, but it's what Apple is going to do to the overall segment. I think it's going to bring a lot more excitement, and definitely double the size or, significant growth to the overall market. So that's what I'm interested to see. And even in our survey results, when asked consumers, would you be interested in Apple foldable, the interest continues to grow, with almost 40% of consumers in the US market saying that, yeah, they are interested in seeing that. So that was, that's what I'm excited to see, the impact on the overall segment and turning it from a niche to possibly more.
We should point out just real quickly here for our viewers, as we were speaking, Apple shares that originally dropped on the back of that earnings report. The shares now have reversed firmly in the green, now up about 3% here. In addition, of course, to what has been a record quarter in terms of sales, $102 billion in revenue, the best September quarter that it's ever had, in the first September quarter here. Remember, they're on that fiscal year that we've seen above that $100 billion mark, Nabila. It gets to this idea of how much you even need to grow in terms of on a percentage basis. Is this, when you start to look at either refresh from existing customers or new adoption by new customers here, what types of percentage increases are you sort of modeling going forward?
So, this is a great question. I'm really glad you brought up installed base, because that's what is really going to help Apple move forward. Aside from the interesting product lineup that they have and the strong updates or innovation, we have about 500 million units of iPhones that were bought in between 2020 and 2021, and that's when the last bump happened, right? The largest growth that we saw in the last 5 years for Apple, as well as the overall market. And given the average life cycle of smartphones, especially Apple, is about 4 to 5 years, this is literally about the time where most of those consumers, again, I meant 500 million, not 500,000, but 500 million iPhones that are, primed for upgrade, and that is what's going to drive growth in the next 2 years. So yes, maybe developed markets might be a little bit flat, but we're going to continue to see strong. I mean, we saw in our data over 20-30% growth in markets like India, almost again very strong double-digit growth from markets like Turkey and other Asia markets. So emerging markets will continue to drive the growth, as well as coming from strong installed base of refresh.